Do you ever wish you had a scale drawing of your yard like this one? One that is drawn to scale so you can keep track of plants and use tracing paper to make design changes? Good news, both these drawings can be made at your kitchen table with basic equipment you probably already have. Take it from me who does this for a living. I'll run through the 4 steps so you know what to expect in this video. First, start with a freehand sketch of the area you want to draw. Nothing fancy, just capture the basic shape. Next, label everything in your drawing like I did in red. So far, pretty easy, right? The third step is to measure the distance between each point and to record each measurement. To make it easier for you, I included a link to the PDF template I use in the description, which is pictured here. The last step is to transfer each point to graph paper using your measurements. The scale of the graph paper is 1 square equals 1 foot to keep this simple. Once you have a scale drawing, it's easy to use tracing paper to capture your thoughts on paper and to be creative with different designs. I'll go over each step in detail. As always, I included chapters so you can easily skip ahead to the part you need. There are a total of 7 chapters, starting with goals. Now, anyone watching this video obviously has an outdoor project in mind. Prior to measuring every anthill and bump in your yard, take a minute to think about the end drawing. Is it a project of your entire house or a small area like your side yard? Your goals will determine how complex your drawing is and how many measurements you need to take. For this video, our goal is to capture the front yard, so I'll focus on this area only. To measure and record measurements, you will first need a tape measure. Tape measures range in size, and your need will depend on your project area. If you need 100 feet or more, you may want to consider a fiberglass tape measure. A 100-foot fiberglass tape measure is around $20. For links to all the tools I use, see the video description. You'll also need a pencil or pen to capture measurements, and you'll need paper. Minimally, blank paper is needed to record a sketch of the house and each measurement. There will be a lot of measurements, and it's important you keep them all separate and clearly labeled. In the description, I attach the link to the template I use, which is pictured here, and we'll discuss in more detail in a minute. Lastly, a clipboard is optional. Even a small area requires many measurements, and it's critical they are easy to read and labeled properly. Using a clipboard makes it easy to keep your papers dry and to prevent the wind from carrying off your measurements. Okay, it's time to sketch. This drawing should be super quick and only take a couple minutes at most. The goal is to capture the general shape of the area, including all key elements, and no measurements are taken at this point. You can see my hand drawing, which I intentionally made way off scale with wavy lines. 2 quick notes. First, it's okay to use multiple sheets to capture detailed areas. Just be sure to label each sheet. Otherwise, when you're drawing, you may have labels with measurements that could correspond to different sheets, which is confusing. Lastly, be sure to capture key elements that will impact your project, like electrical outlets, drainage, outdoor speakers, stepping stones, lights, water faucets, dryer vents, and electrical meters. At this point, don't worry about using symbols or anything sophisticated. Just put 1 or 2 words so you remember what is there. And we're all done with the sketch. The good news is the next step is just as easy. It's time to label everything. I like to start in one corner and work my way around the house. Then I'll go back and include other items like paths, trees, and shrubs that are away from the house. I typically use letters A, B, C, and so on. If you get to Z, you can add numbers, so you're using A1, B1, C1, or double the letter, so you're using AA, BB, CC, and so on. Whichever you choose, remember, the most important piece is that the labels are clear and easy to read, and that everything you sketched has a label. If you see something you missed when sketching, then now's the time to add it. That was a quick step. Now we're on to measuring and recording. But before we record any measurements, I want to take a minute to review the template I use to capture measurements. The goal of this sheet is to keep measurements separate and legible since there are so many to record. The first column is for the name of the sheet that you sketched. If you only use one sketch, then you can leave this field blank. The second and third columns are to record the 2 points you are measuring, like points A and B. In the fourth column, capture the measurement. I always use feet and inches for consistency. And lastly is a column for any notes. Typically, I use this to capture window height or to capture the circumference of tree trunks and the width of a tree from the drip line. Okay, so now it's time for Measuring 101. I know measuring seems pretty intuitive, but I've seen this go wrong. One example where measuring can go wrong is not holding the tape measure level. In this example, the correct measurement should be 20 feet. However, the tape measure starts at the ground and is being held over 6 feet in the air, which increases the distance to 21 feet instead of 20 feet. So, if you are measuring the distance to a window, which doesn't typically touch the ground, then be sure to hold the tape measure level at window height. Next up, how many measurements do you need? When measuring distances along the house, one measurement is sufficient and can be recorded one of two ways. The first is to measure each distance separately. From A to B, which is 3 feet, from B to C, which is 8 feet, and from C to D, which is 3 feet, and so on. Another option, which may be a little quicker, is to extend the measuring tape the entire length of the house and to capture the measurement at each point from A to B, which is 3 feet, A to C, which is 11 feet, and from A to D, which is 14 feet, and so on. Both are correct, and the best technique is typically based on the number of helpers you have. Next up is measuring items not attached to the house, like this tree in the yard. This will require 2 separate measurements to triangulate the location. I want to highlight 2 points that will make this easier. I recommend measuring alongside the tree trunk to determine the center and not to measure to the edge of the tree trunk. While this may not be as precise, it makes it much easier when drafting. Second is to use 2 points that are not near each other. Instead of measuring from one corner of the house and the edge of the patio, I use separate edges of the house which are not next to each other. The last measuring point to cover is curves, which can be tricky to capture depending on where the curve is located and the curve length. If you have a large curve, I like to use a separate sheet of paper to sketch and capture measurements and notes. I'll walk through an example capturing the curve in our walkway. I like to start by ensuring I captured the straight points leading to the curve and triangulate each of these positions individually. In this drawing, these points would be A, B, C, and D. Next, we need to capture several points along the curve that we can use to connect the dots with a French curve when it's time to put this on graph paper. To capture these points, measure in 1 foot intervals along the house from point D. Next, measure these intervals to the curve, keeping the tape measure parallel with the path. The benefit of using 1 foot intervals is to align easily with our graph paper, but you may need to use different intervals for your curve. Repeat this process until you have enough points to replicate the curve. And just like that, we've captured all the measurements we need for our drawing in a neat and orderly fashion. Now, it's time to take our measurements and draw them to scale. Let's start by covering tools I use, which all have links in the description. The first item is a pencil, which is used to lightly draw with the ability to erase, which brings us to our second item, an eraser, which is used to clean up mistakes. A pencil sharpener is needed to keep you on point, and pens come in handy to darken lines so they are easy to see through to the tracing paper. You will also need circle templates or a compass. The compass is more precise, but is not as easy to use as circle templates. For graph paper, look for an 8x8 grid, which is easy to use when drawing and when installing. Being able to quickly count squares while outside is ideal, so you don't have to remeasure everything with a scale. For paper size, you have two options. I like 8.5 by 11 inch paper, which is easy to transport in a folder, or use a copy machine to make a photocopy. On the other hand, rolls of paper are cheaper. To attach the grid paper to your table while working, I like to use drafting dots. However, if you have painter's tape at home, this should secure your paper without ripping the paper once you're done. If you're not using drafting dots, I recommend testing the tape on the paper prior to completing your drawing so you don't have a large tear at the end. A rolling ruler is optional for straight lines, but any straight edge you have at home will work. I listed a French curve as optional, and it really depends on your home and your project. If you want natural looking curvy borders and paths, then you'll need a French curve. If you have a rectangular path and square beds, then you may be able to get away without a French curve. I do want to mention that many circle templates include a French curve, so you may be able to purchase both at once. Lastly, yes, I'm crazy, I listed a scale as optional. I don't want to advocate being wasteful, so if this is a one-time project, then you can use the graph paper as your scale. I'll transition into drafting by covering triangle scale basics so you can determine if you need to make a purchase or if you want to try to use the graph paper as your scale. To start, there are 3 sides to the ruler with 6 different scales. As an example, let's look at the side which has 1/8 inch markings on the left and 1/4 inch markings on the right. So if you wanted to use 1/4 inch scale, you would measure using the larger numbers starting with 0. On the other side is the scale I'll be using, which is 1/8 inch. Any measurements in this scale would start with 0 using the smaller numbers closer to the edge. In this picture, let's compare the 1/8 inch scale with the 16 inch scale and our graph paper. I'll start with 16 inches, which is a standard ruler with 16 measurements that make 1 inch. Notice how the points align with the graph paper squares, which are 1/8 of an inch. Now, look at the other ruler where the scale is 1/8 inch equals 1 foot, and you can see how one marking matches the graph paper. To note, the unit on the scale shows 46, which relates to the 1/4 inch scale if you were measuring from the other end of the scale. So, using the smaller 1/8 inch scale, let's measure 4 feet by starting at 0 and counting 4 squares on the graph paper. While I have the scale out, I'll cover how to triangulate a position with 3 measurements and a compass. In this example, we'll determine where the tree is located, which is 20 feet from the corner of the patio. I put my scale on the table with 1/8 inch facing up and open the compass so one end is on 0 and the other is on 20. I'll make a partial circle, pressing lightly in the area where I believe the tree is located. Then I look at the other measurement, which is 30 feet from the corner of the house. I adjust my compass and repeat the process, but this time I'm just marking where the 2 lines meet, which is the center location of the tree. The same process is used to triangulate any position. Now that you have all your measurements and you know how to use the equipment, let's start drawing. Start by taping your paper to the desk. Next, validate the drawing will fit on your paper using a scale of 1/8 inch by looking at the largest measurement for the width and length to make a rectangle to ensure it will fit on the graph paper. The drawing doesn't need to be perfectly centered, but you want to ensure everything you measured will fit and you don't need a larger piece of paper or a different scale. Next, start in the corner of the house and take measurements from your sheets and lightly mark them on the graph paper. I'll typically work my way around the house the same way we did when we were taking measurements. It's okay if you want to jump around between sheets and measurements while completing this step. Once everything is captured on paper, you can darken in the lines by pressing harder with the pencil, or I like to use a pen. At this point, we're done. Now the scope of this video was to complete a base drawing. However, if you plan to use your drawing to create a landscape plan, then I'll point you in the right direction. you'll need tracing paper and colored pencils or markers, which I've also included in the description. Tape the tracing paper over the landscape plan and quickly trace the lines of the building. I do this freehand, knowing I'll complete several designs to explore different ideas. Continue to experiment until you have the size and shape just right, and you can add color to help visualize the space. That's all for this video. Please leave me a comment to let me know how your project turned out. As always, thank you for watching, and please subscribe to our channel to be notified as we post new content.